Hello, and welcome to the University of Kentucky Forestry Webinar Series. My name is Billy Thomas. I'm an extension forester here in the Department of Forestry, and we've got a webinar coming up on implementing a sustainable timber harvest. And I'll be introducing Chris Reeves here in just a moment. But before we do that, I do want to mention that there is a chat pod that you can use to put questions in. We will be reviewing those questions as we go, and we will have a period at the end to address those questions. I would like to thank the county extension agents out there that are serving as hosts all across Kentucky. And I would also like to thank you all for being with us. We certainly appreciate you all spending your time with us. I think it'll be really worth your time. So, Chris, welcome to the Forestry Webinar Series. I'm glad to have you with us. Again, we're going to be talking about implementing a sustainable timber harvest, certainly an important topic for people.
Right, and I'm glad to be here this evening, and it's an important topic, I think, for the woodland owners in Kentucky and all the surrounding states here. We spend a lot of time talking about timber and trees and what's the right practices to implement in your woodlands, but that's not really going to be the focus of tonight's topic. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the other things that make a sustainable timber harvest important and things that woodland owners might not really pay that much attention to, but stuff that they need to really be aware of.
Okay. Yeah, I really think, I had a chance to preview your presentation a little earlier, and I think people are going to get a lot out of it. And, I will say that we're really lucky to have you here with us, Chris. Chris is really well qualified to give this presentation tonight. Chris has his undergrad and master's in forestry here from the University of Kentucky. Chris has experience working in the private sector in a consulting forestry operation. But Chris did his master's on some of the best management practices that we'll be talking about, protecting water quality. Chris also runs our forest management section of our Center for Forest and Wood Certification, and he may mention that a little bit more. But Chris, we're so glad to have you with us tonight, and I think people are going to get a lot out of it. So thank you so much, and without any further ado, we'll turn the presentation over to you.
All right, thanks, Billy. We'll go ahead and pull up the presentation. And again, I'm glad to be here this evening. My name is Christopher Reeves, and I do work at the University of Kentucky in the Department of Forestry here in Lexington's campus, and we're going to get started talking tonight about implementing sustainable timber harvest. So the first thing I'll kind of start off with tonight is that the word sustainable really means different things to different people and organizations. It's completely nebulous, and it really depends on the eye of the beholder. So when we talk kind of big scale sustainable forestry, either in a large regional context, either the state of Kentucky or maybe something as big as the United States or even the entire world, usually they want to ensure some form of long-term wood supply. Are we growing more wood than we're cutting? You may also consider some form of practices that don't harm hunting or wildlife, or even on some of the global scale, sustainable may mean that you're not contributing to climate change, or you're doing some form of carbon sequestration to sort of improve the world. So the word sustainable kind of is a really nebulous word that means different things to different people, and some people it doesn't really mean anything. So it's important to kind of talk about what sustainable timber practice is. And during this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about the things that I and other natural resource professionals think it's important that woodland owners know about sustainable practices. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about these kind of 7 items today, tonight, and I'm really not going to give that much detail about them because every single one of these you could spend an entire webinar just on that topic alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, give you some basic information and some practices that you may want to implement to protect and conserve these areas. So the very first one, we're going to spend some time talking about the appropriate trees to harvest and remain. And again, I'm not going to spend that much time talking about it, but just hit some brief topics that are important to you. We'll also cover a little bit of information about soils as well as water quality, talk about some special sites, as well as covering a little bit about wildlife and some rare, threatened, and endangered species, and then kind of finish up speaking very briefly about some aesthetic preservation. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about the trees that are harvested. And again, it's not the full focus of this talk. There's so many different types of woodlands that our landowners have, young stands that have really very many small trees on it, all the way to old growth stands where there's few big trees per acre. So it's really difficult for me to talk about what sustainable means when you're talking about what trees should and should not be cut down. However, I'm going to just mention a few key concepts when it comes to talking about the trees themselves. The first thing I'll mention is that clear cuts are not inherently bad. They're also not inherently good. There are times and places that clear cuts should be implemented, and there are places where clear cuts absolutely should not be implemented. And a couple of places where clear cuts may be appropriate is if you're in a stand that's had some sort of a natural disaster and the trees that are standing have a lot of broken tops or species you don't like. Natural disasters sometimes include tornadoes. Really common in western and central Kentucky is ice storms. You may also have some problems with insects and diseases. So clear cuts may be appropriate for that area. But if you're in a really steep mountainous area, you may not want to implement a clear cut. Your soils may not be of the appropriate type where they can maintain health and vigor in an area where it's really steep and you'll lose a lot of soil through erosion. So it's important to work with your forester, your natural resource professional to determine whether or not a clear cut is right for your area. The same goes on the opposite end of the spectrum. So single tree selection, picking a few trees can be bad. It may lead to a practice called high grading, where you just take the large and most valuable trees, and the trees that remaining are not of very good quality or very good species, and they may not be able to meet your objectives. You may be taking out a good acorn producing tree, and that's going to have a huge impact on your wildlife and change the amount of deer or turkey or songbird that's there. So single tree selection may be good in certain circumstances, it may be bad. We already talked a little bit about high grading. So one other thing that woodland owners must be aware of, that when a timber harvest does happen, you need to ensure you select a good logger to minimize the amount of residual tree damage. Studies done in Kentucky and other similar hardwood states like Virginia and West Virginia and parts of Ohio, we've determined that if you've got a really good logger or even an average logger, that you should expect about 10% damage on your residual trees. And so you'll get some bottom parts of trees that are a little bit scuffed up from logging damage. You may even have some trees that are damaged up in the tops of them where it's been scuffed up by another tree falling down when it was felled, or some wind damage. So that I'm not going to say that it's the best logger in the world to have a 0% residual damage, but you're looking at about 10% is what's realistic. It's going to happen. So you have to be aware that those impacts are going to happen, and that they are expected, but you don't want to have a logger that's going to have a lot of residual damage, because those trees are the future when you do a timber harvest. One thing I will go ahead and point out is, if you are more interested in finding about different harvesting treatments and certain timber stand improvement practices that you may want to do, I'll encourage you to attend another webinar that's in the Future series on Thursday, December 15th by Billy Thomas. He's going to be talking about caring for your woodlands, and it's going to be talking about developing a management plan, get into a lot more detail about common woodland practices, and identify some sources of help. So obviously that's going to be held at many of these same sites. I would encourage you to check with your current local extension office, see if they offer that webinar. And if you're not able to make that webinar for whatever reason, you can visit ukforestry.org to view those archive webinars and to check out a lot more detail of specific what we call silviculture prescriptions that'll detail what trees should and should not be taken out based on your objectives. So we'll go ahead and segue into some other topics. So obviously soils are extremely very important. You need to know what type of soils you have in your woodlands, and even if you own a farm or ag land or whatever types of property you have, you need to know what type of soils are present so you can better protect them, so you can prevent their erosion and kind of keep them in a really good state. So there really is a good database of the information of what types of soils are out there. The Natural Resource and Conservation Service maintains a database of all the soils that have been mapped across the entire United States, and you can use their online interaction to find out what types of soils are on your property. So we're going to give you a quick example of how the program works. So it's pretty easy to find. If you go to any sort of internet search bar, Google, Yahoo, Bing, whatever, and search for Web Soil Survey, the first hit will come up will be this website here. It's a website that's obviously, again, managed by the NRCS, and it's the Web Soil Survey. You can click this green button that's up on your screen, and it'll bring you to another window that comes up. And you'll start out at a full view of the United States, and you'll have to zoom in on your specific property to find out where your soils are located. So this is obviously is a map of Kentucky, and we're going to kind of zoom in and come up with a specific example that we've got. Oh, looks like it started a new session, so we'll restart that here. All right, so this is what it looks like when you start at the beginning here. Again, we're going to zoom back in on Kentucky, and I'm actually going to go to a place in eastern Kentucky where our research forest is, in Breathitt and Knott counties, where Robinson Forest is located, and just show you an example of how this program runs. So again, we're looking at the soil surveys here, so we're going to zoom in a little bit further here. So the key thing when you use this online soil survey is to define what the Natural Resource Conservation Service is called, the AOI. It's the area of intent. So once you get kind of close to what you're looking at, you can click on this button here, define your area of intent, and it's best to use either the polygon draw tool. So you'll kind of just click a brief area here, and I'm going to again make up a made-up little section here within Robinson Forest. You can obviously use your property boundaries for what works best for you here. So we're going to get that drawn up here. So once that's drawn up here, it'll create an area of intent for us. It's going to zoom in on that property. And once that's brought up here, again, you'll see where the boundaries are clearly marked. It's got a bunch of cross thatches on here that'll show us where the area of intent is. And once you're satisfied that you've selected the appropriate area of intent, you'll then need to click one of the tabs up here. The best tab is the soil map one, so we'll click the soil map here. And once that's done, you'll see a soil map here. I'll zoom out a little bit so we can see the whole property there. Grab my little hand, drag it up. So again, you'll see this interface is a little bit more clunkier than something you may be familiar with, Google Maps or Bing, but it's still a pretty good interface to use it. So you'll see here the different letters that mean the different soil types. And it brought up a nice table here of the different types of soils that we have. The CSC, Cloverlick, Schlachta, Kemper complex, tells us how many acres we have in that area and how much percent of the area is within that. And I'll just be honest with you, I do not know what any of these map units mean at all, these names. Soil scientists and other landowners might know a little bit more about it, but there's different information within these that are actually a lot more useful. So if we go back to the let's go to the Soil Data Explorer here for a little bit more information. And these tabs that are here on the left are very useful when determining what types of soils you have in here. So particularly I'll point out the land management site in here. So if we go look at soil rutting hazard, rutting is when there is a case of tires kind of being stuck in the mud and they get all squished up and the mud kind of comes up and it kind of creates a little pond there. So you can click the soil rutting hazard and click on the ratings here. And so the computer will run an analysis for you, and it'll tell you which of your soils and how much of them have specific soil ratings at this scale. So you can see the red areas here, this SGE, are highly erodible, and these yellow areas here are moderately erodible. So one thing I'll point out, most of the forestry soils where forest and woodlands are located usually have some form of moderate to heavy erosion. So you know that when you do a timber harvest, when these soils are present, you need to be really on the watch and make sure your loggers and your foresters are paying attention to these areas of highly erodible soils so that they implement practices to keep the soil in place as well as protect water quality. One other thing I'll point out here, I'll go to the vegetative productivity section here. There's actually a section on forest productivity where it can give you some information about site index as well as some productivity answers. So I'll encourage woodland owners to kind of get on this system here. Again, you can do a Google search on Web Soil Survey, and it'll take you to this website where you can follow along with it. I'll also go ahead and point out that although they've got that fancy web interface, there actually is the old-fashioned paper soil surveys are still really, really valuable and contain the same information in it. It may not be able to tell you a specific percentages in your woodlands, but it will still provide information about what soils are out there, give you those same erodibility ratings as well as productivity ratings. And those are available obviously at your county extension office. There's one for every county in Kentucky. This is a picture of the Breathitt County survey. A couple of counties have one or two combined in them, so you can kind of work with those. There's aerial photographs of the entire county in the soil survey, and you can find those charts about productivity and erodibility in the back. And it's the same ratings that are online, so nothing really is different, and they're still extremely useful. So the next topic we're going to spend some time on is talking about water quality. So the biggest issue for water quality for sustainable timber harvest in our area is mostly about pollution. And pollution in Kentucky comes from three major sources. One you're obviously pretty familiar with is dirt that gets into streams and creates sediment and mud and can decrease the quality habitat for fishes and other aquatic animals. Another one that some people might not be aware of is light pollution. So obviously in the woodlands, we've got a lot of leaves and needles that are on the trees either during the summer, and they've started to fall now in the fall, and you've got a little bit more light that comes on in the streams. And if you're in an area that's very, very shaded for a long time and all of a sudden you take all the trees out of the way, a lot more sunlight is going to get to those streams, and it's going to heat up the water. And certain fish species and crayfish and other types of mussels really don't like that change. They don't like to be in that heavier or that hotter environment, and they don't respond well. Either they die or move to other areas. You also got direct pollution from other fluids, such as logging equipment, either hydraulic fluid or gasoline. A big issue in the western United States is quantity. So they're all about water rights in the western U.S., but for the most part, that's not really a huge issue in Kentucky or even our woodlands. But in areas with potentially heavy urbanization or surface mines, you may be subject to higher water quality or water quantity issues that may cause some deals with flooding. But for traditional woodlands and forestry, we're not that concerned with quantity. It's all about pollution. So the state of Kentucky passed a law in the late 90s called the Forest Conservation Act that requires what are called best management practices, or BMPs, to be applied on every single timber harvest in Kentucky. And so they regulate practices that go on in Kentucky that deal with just water quality practices. So we're going to talk some about skid trails, haul roads, landings, streamside management zones, and some revegetation issues. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about rutting kind of as an example of some of the new best management practices that are being implemented. So we've had BMPs in Kentucky for about 15 years now, and starting in January of 2017, there's going to be a little bit of tweaks to what the minimum requirements are for loggers and landowners in Kentucky. So just give you an example of one of those things that's kind of changed. So in the old standard rutting, which we talked a little bit about earlier for soils, and this is a prime example of what a rut looks like. You've got a big skid trail here where a county ranger is standing in a rut that seems fairly deep. I'd say that's about probably 20 to 24 inches that's been caused by logging during a wet time. That's caused a pretty sizable rut in the stream. So the old minimum requirements were that all of these ruts that were bigger than 12 inches had to be fixed regardless of where they were. But the current law, there's a little bit of changes, and rather than having to fix all of the ruts, the new standard talks about critical areas only have to be smooth. So these critical areas are areas that have some sort of connection to the stream. So the best example that we've been provided from some of the new regulations is that if you've got a skid trail that's at the very, very top of a hollow or a ridge top, that there's no way that water could ever reach the stream. It's a half mile away. There's a big berm in the way that water's not really going to move from this side at all. It doesn't have to be fixed to meet the minimum requirement that's coming and starting in January. Now, I don't think that's good practice to not fix these ruts, but woodland owners need to be aware that loggers will not be required to fix these in Kentucky. So that's a drastic change and something new that's coming out of it. But it sort of makes sense because the regulations that were passed by the state legislature in the late 90s said that they were only to address water quality. And although this picture here looks really bad, and I think it is really bad, these ruts do not have to be fixed in areas where it's not critical or there's no chance of water meeting it. But I would highly encourage woodland owners that you have some sort of mechanism for these ruts to be fixed, and they need to be specifically mentioned in some sort of documentation. That's usually done through a contract. So for a sustainable timber harvest, I would highly recommend that woodland owners have some sort of mechanism to fix all of the ruts in their woodlands during a timber harvest, not just the ones that are important for water quality. So you need to have some sort of mechanism to get these ruts fixed. So if you're not familiar with what a timber harvest in Kentucky usually looks like, this is a really good aerial photograph here. So this is where the landing is located, and the landing essentially is the central hub of a timber harvest. It's the place where all the big equipment is taken, all the log trucks are loaded, and they'll haul out this kind of road here at the bottom of the picture and take those to the sawmill. So a landing is kind of the central processing hub. And throughout the woodlands, they'll build these what are called skid trails. Essentially, these are trails that obviously go into the woods, and they're the trails that kind of provide the network of road system throughout, where the loggers will cut the trees down and bring them back to the landing, and that's called skidding. And you'll develop a network of these throughout a trail system. So there are requirements that have to be done for these skid trails, as well as the landings and a little bit of the haul roads. Now we're going to spend some time talking about the skid trails. So trails and haul roads and other equipment have to be kept at least 50 feet away on flat ground and 100 feet away on steep ground. This is essentially to prevent any sort of mud that is generated when rains come that goes down a road and picks up sediment and dirt and then gets diverted into the woodlands from keeping any sort of stream. So research has found that on flat ground, as long as you keep equipment 50 feet away and 100 feet away, you're really good to keep the mud out of the stream. That's not to say that you can't put any equipment closer, because that may happen. You may have a landing at the bottom of a hill. There may be a cliff line. There may be some sort of sensitive area that's in the way. So there are some provisions within the minimum requirements that if you do want to go a little bit closer, you're allowed to, but you have to take some extra precautions. Those extra precautions could include putting in extra water control structures. You may need to put in some silt fences, but if you're within 100 feet or 50 feet, there has to be some extra precautions taken to prevent that sediment from entering the stream. So this is kind of what it looks like on the ground for two different stream types here. So when you're talking about perennial streams, and a perennial stream is a stream that runs year-round, and it's constantly flowing almost year-round. I'd say right now, during the kind of the drought we've been on the last month, you may have a couple of streams that may have dried out. So when you're in an area like this where it's relatively flat ground here, the SMZ width only is 25 feet, and you can have a skid trail that's that far out. And SMZ width here, this says 50, but it's actually, or 55, it's actually 50 feet. It's a little bit closer. These areas, you have to keep out the skid trails on it. One other important thing to note, like I mentioned earlier during the skid trail section, was I mentioned the term reverse grade structures. These are structures put on skid trails to get the water off of the exposed bare soil of skid trails and to get them into the forest floor, which provides a lot of natural filtration from the soil that's held in place, as well as some of the leaf litter. So you want to have some form of reverse grade structure, and essentially that's a fancy word for some sort of bump or divot that's put in a trail to get the water off. So you've heard of water bars. You may have outslope trails, sort of kind of a slope trail that's not super steep, but has some incline on it. When the rains finally come, the water diverts off the trail and gets into the forest floor and provides a lot of natural filtration to protect water quality. Obviously, when you're in steeper areas that have a pretty steep slope, you're going to want more water bars in an area than an area that's in flat ground. So when the slopes are steeper, the water can build up a tremendous amount of momentum and cause a lot of erosion. So you want to put as many of these water bars or other types of broad-based dips or whatever you can put in to slow the water down, to get it off the trail as fast as possible, and to get it into the forest floor so it can kind of spread out and filter itself before it gets to the stream. You mentioned the landings, and there's a couple of items you must be aware of to protect water quality around landings. These are areas where logs are brought, again, to be processed and loaded on trucks. And the size of one of these essentially depends on the total size of a harvest. If you're a woodland owner that's doing a harvest that may be 15 acres, you can probably have a small landing, a lot like the one in this photo, where it's a small log truck and a small loader and a relatively small pile of logs that's in place. But if you've got a pretty sizable harvest, maybe 200-300 acres, that they use multiple bulldozers and multiple skidders, you're going to have a lot larger landing and maybe a section that they pull up 2 or 3 semi-trucks. So you're going to need a lot bigger landing and therefore have to have a lot more precautions that should be taken. So in one of these areas, obviously, a lot of the trees are removed, almost all of them. It kind of looks like a really flat area. And because you have so much heavy equipment running around, it's going to be heavily compacted. And so any of the water that gets on there is going to pick up steam pretty quickly and begin to move off fairly quickly. And you got to have a lot of concern for the areas and ensure that the landings do not directly drain into streams. So if you do have some sort of landing that's right next to a stream for whatever reason, that's where the county road is located. There's nowhere else really to put it. It would cause more environmental damage to put it somewhere else. You're going to need some additional mitigation, and usually that's done by either building a small berm of logging debris, so you can pile up some slash around the edges to act as a natural buffer. You could potentially put in some mulch, use either some hay or straw or even some traditional bark mulch. You can also install a small amount of silt fences to catch some of the sediment. Silt fences obviously aren't a long-term solution, but you'll need something to protect the water quality, because there is a lot of activity that goes on landings and a lot of equipment that moves back and forth. And these areas could cause substantial damage to water quality if not properly built, placed, or even retired. And those areas where these are built on top of the ridges, it's a lot easier to work up there because you're very far away from the streams and other types of areas that may be impacted by negative water quality. One thing we'd encourage, obviously, is to if you've got one of these landings that's put close to a stream, you're going to want to revegetate this area as quickly as possible. We found that if you don't really do any sort of remediation on these landings, they're so heavily compacted that you're really not going to get very good revegetation if you just throw the seed out there. You're essentially just feeding the turkeys if you just throw the seed out there. It's not going to germinate. There is not a suitable hosting bed for it to grow really well. So you need to do some form of other remediation. So if you put the seeds out there, usually some combination of winter wheat or rye or some other grass, it's usually best to pick whatever grass is going to germinate the best for the time frame you're using it. We've got some recommendations on our website of which ones to use, but it's going to need some form of additional thing. Usually mulch is something that you could do. It keeps the turkeys from getting it, but it also allows it to be shaded a little bit more. And I'd also recommend disking some of the area. Some people may have some tractors or some farm equipment that you may be able to disc some of these landings. Sometimes these landings are actually converted to native warm season grass food plots for wildlife. The best thing that we found that actually worked surprisingly well was fertilizer. That may not be that surprising, but it worked really well even compared to disking or mulching. But you put a little bit of fertilizer down there, the grass took off really, really well. It was able to hold the soil on the landings, and when it does finally rain, you don't have as much erosion as you would normally have on a landing. So the next thing we'll talk about is Streamside Management Zone, and these Streamside Management Zones are implemented mainly to limit the amount of light pollution that we were talking about earlier that harm aquatic insects as well as fish that are in the stream. So I'm only going to spend some time talking about the perennial streams. We mentioned earlier, a perennial stream is an area that flows year-round. And in Kentucky, we do have laws that talk about where trees must remain in the overstory. So in Kentucky, the current law and even the new law in the BMP says that 50% of the overstory canopy must remain. So if you're familiar with some forestry concepts, the overstory refers to the dominant and co-dominant trees. And these trees have large and full crowns in the canopy that get full sunlight. So 50% of those big crown trees have to stay in the overstory. And we found through numerous research studies that even just leaving 50% of the canopy will not affect the amount of light and the temperature in the stream. So you can still remove some trees, but you still have to have 50% of the overstory to remain to keep that light pollution. So you can kind of see an example in this photo of what that looks like. So the current law, again, states that it's got to be 55 feet wide. That is actually going to change in January. The current thing is being changed to a 50-foot wide SMZ. So you'll kind of see this line down here around a perennial stream where all these trees are still standing. 50% of the canopy is still there, and up on the upslope, it's kind of harvested at its full thing. So these SMZs are meant to protect the water quality. In this case, we're limiting the pollutant of light, and that keeps the fish and the crayfish and all the mayflies happy, and keeps a well-functioning riparian ecosystem. So this is what it looks like overhead. Here on the left side of the screen, you got an uncut SMZ. The green trees are these co-dominant and dominant trees that are in the overstory. They've got full crowns in them. They're not just getting a little bit of sun, they're getting a lot of sun here. And compare it to the stand on the right where there's been some cutting. You'll see these stumps that are standing here, and 50% of these overstory trees are standing. And obviously from these, you'll need a pretty good geographic spread on the ground. You'll want some on both sides of the bank. You can maybe take a little bit from over here, maybe have two together, but try to space it out so there's a pretty good canopy over the stream to protect the species. You don't really want to take everything in one area and then maybe not in another, but you want to be judicious about the trees you want to take. All right, so I'll close with a little bit more information about BMPs. So as I mentioned earlier, we are the only state in the South that has legislatively mandated inspections for BMPs. There's a small cadre of about, I think it's 3 or 4 dozen county rangers that work for the Kentucky Division of Forestry. And one of their primary responsibilities is they're responsible for these inspections. Now, although that might sound like a lot of people, they don't necessarily have the manpower to cover almost all logging jobs. Lately, they've been able to hit around 50% of the logging jobs. And just as I talked about earlier, these county rangers are only inspecting to meet the minimum requirements that are listed in the BMPs. If you as a landowner want more than what's required for the BMPs, you'd need some form of written agreement. And the best example I talked about earlier was the rutting. So the rutting in the BMPs is only concerned with water quality. And if you want them to fix all of the ruts, regardless if it has to do with water quality or productivity or an area where you just want to ride your 4x4 or your side-by-side or ATV up an area and you want them to fix those ruts, you need to have that in the written agreement, and usually that's done with the contract. So there has to be an agreement with the landowner and the logger, or your forester and the logger, so they understand that if they want to go above and beyond what the minimum requirements are, they need to be written down so everybody understands what has to be done. And just so mainly you protect yourself and you protect the logger, so everybody understands there's a fair business transaction, and everybody is understanding what's expected both up front as well as to close out the job. All right, so we'll segue off of the BMPs and talking about water quality to mention a little bit of information about special sites. And special sites kind of is a catch-all term that covers all of the things that you may run into in the woodlands. So some of the most common things are a cemetery or some other archaeological site, rock shelters, cliff lines, or even some sort of rare habitat such as a wetland or a bog or a savanna. And essentially, I call this stuff anything that's weird. If you got anything that's not a traditional woodlands, cliff line, or some sort of rare habitat that's not common, you'll need to have a small amount of protection or conservation measures in place if you do want to timber harvest. You do not want these places to be harmed, or you don't want their characteristics that they value or what makes them important to be harmed during a timber harvest. So if you've got these on your property, you're going to need to take some extra precautions and definitely make the harvesters aware of what's going on. So I'll go through a couple of these. I'm certainly not an expert in rare habitat, but I can provide some examples of what we're talking about and give you a little bit of information about what you need to do to protect these areas. So cemeteries obviously are hugely important, particularly in our rural communities in Kentucky. These areas are highly protected by both folks who have people buried in them, as well as just being community landmarks and just important to the community. If you've got one of these areas in your woodlands, they need to be mapped and flagged on the ground. So your loggers or even hunters or people that may be on your property for whatever reason, they know where they are, and they respect that these areas are in place, and they know that they're important to you and the community. Obviously, you want to keep equipment out of these areas. Logging equipment, both skidders, bulldozers, semi-trucks are big pieces of equipment that can cause long-lasting damage in just seconds. So you want to try to keep these equipment out of the area. Another important thing is that you want to make sure that you don't fell any of the trees in it unless there's a specific reason for that. or if you do fell trees, that you want to have them fall in a manner that they do not endanger any sort of the tombstones or any of the areas within the cemetery. This may not be possible with some trees. They may lean too far towards the cemetery, and you may even consider just not cutting those trees down. So it's important that you have a forester, or you kind of use your own intuition to find out whether or not certain trees may or may not be worth cutting down in the area. And sometimes this is a big topic when communities want to expand cemeteries into areas where woodlands are already present. So you need to be careful that you have a professional that's cutting the trees down and bringing up the stumps, so they know that they need to protect the areas that are already there. Some important caveats: if you find one in your woodlands, there are numerous federal and state laws about the protection of human remains and graves. So if you do find one, you're going to want to alert your local authorities. Usually that's done through the local sheriff's office, or even sometimes the coroner. So if you do find a cemetery that you didn't know that was there, you do need to alert someone in the government so they can map that and let people know that it's there and be protected for the time being, or even in the future. So these areas are vitally important for communities and families, and they need to be protected and maintained, just like any sort of conservation area. These special sites are very important for sustainable forestry and sustainable communities. An area such as a wetland obviously can be harmed by logging equipment. Again, you want these areas mapped and flagged. While there is water present, you want to keep equipment out of these areas. That's not to say that you can't implement a harvest in a wetland, but you have to be extremely careful, and your logger needs to have a lot of experience and knowledge of working in these areas. And obviously you want to try to keep some of the trees out of the wetlands. You don't want to get into any situations where you've clogged a drain or created some sort of water body situation where you have some issues with the division of water. So you want to fell trees away from the area. I would highly advise against cutting trees down in wetlands. They're really difficult to regrow, but if you do decide to cut trees down in wetlands, work with an experienced logger and a natural resource professional to determine whether or not it's really the right thing to do for these areas. So the amount of wetlands in Kentucky has drastically decreased over the last couple of years, so you really need to be careful with the ones that you do have. Rock shelters are pretty easy and ubiquitous to find across Kentucky. You want to keep equipment out of the top and the bottom, and usually around a 25 or a 50-foot buffer is recommended. And again, say this over and over again, the areas need to be mapped and flagged. There is a potential that there may be an archaeological site in the area, and rock shelters offer a lot of unique habitat for an area that there may be some rare animals and plants in the area that you may not be aware of that are there, and you need to protect these stands and ensure that a rock shelter is protected during a timber harvest. Cliff lines kind of go the same way. You may not have a straight rock shelter in the area, but these cliff lines offer unique habitats, some thin soil areas that may be prime real estate for specific plants, and we'll talk a little bit about one later. But again, these areas need to be mapped and flagged on the ground, so timber harvest operators know to stay out of these areas. The recommendations for equipment exclusion zones around cliff lines vary based on whether they're south facing in a lot of sun or whether they're moist areas. So usually, again, around the 25-foot buffer top and bottom is what works best. But I would have these areas kind of investigated by natural resource professionals just to see if you've got anything unique that may require the buffers to be a lot larger, a lot bigger. So one thing, again, I'll briefly touch on here is the impacts of timber harvesting and sustainable forestry on wildlife. So harvesting itself is not inherently bad for wildlife. It's not inherently good either. You'll have effects on all manner of species. The obvious ones you'll see are elk, bears, turkeys, and deers in areas. There are also effects on birds, and I'll give you two examples in the next couple of slides to talk about that, as well as potentially affecting reptiles and amphibians. So we don't have very much time to talk about the specific impacts on maybe your favorite species, but it's important to know that when you make a timber harvest plan that you're well aware of what the impacts on the wildlife of that plan is going to be. And are you okay with that plan? Are you okay with potentially losing habitat for deer to come? Are you okay with leaving lost songbirds? Are you okay for making habitat for different types of birds? Just important that you know what that impact is going to be, and will those impacts meet what your objectives are. So as an example of two different bird species, ruffed grouse is an early successional species. They need very open and young stands and young woodlands particularly to nest and have drumming areas for their logs. Because of the type of harvesting in Kentucky that has favored mostly single tree selection and the allowing of woodlands to mature, the numbers of grouse in Kentucky have drastically dropped over the last couple of decades. So if you're in an area that maybe you favor grouse, maybe you'll implement a harvest that is a little bit heavier cut, that's a little bit more sustainable towards the grouse population. Now I would contrast that with another species, Cerulean warblers. These animals migrate from South America up here for the summertime for nesting, and they need mature hardwood forest for both their breeding and nesting services. They're strongly associated with large diameter oaks and hickories. And so again, you can see that the two different types of habitat that both the warbler and the ruffed grouse need. You need to know whether you implement a single tree selection or a clear cut that may be more favorable towards grouse, that there are going to be effects on wildlife, and that's both good and bad, but you just need to know that these impacts are going to happen, and whether or not it meets your objectives to provide habitat for either of these two species, there's going to be impacts on the wildlife. And because of that, I would highly encourage anybody that has a specific wildlife objective, in addition to working with the Kentucky Division of Forestry Service Foresters, you consider working with a private lands biologist. These state workers work with private landowners to develop specific plans for their specific goals and species, and they work hand in hand with the Kentucky Division of Forestry Service Foresters to provide input and management advice if you do want to manage for a specific species. And they can also give you some information about potential negative impacts for species you may not be thinking about. I'll display this map kind of just as an example to show you that there are almost or a little over a dozen private lands biologists located in all parts of the state that are available to woodland owners in Kentucky that work with landowners, and they also work with foresters hand in hand to develop management plans for your woodlands at no cost to figure out what types of species you want to work with. So I would obviously encourage people to visit the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife website, where this map is posted. You just kind of go to the private lands page, and you can pull up this map and see what private lands biologists is available in your area, and see if they can come check things out for you. I'll close with a couple of other things here, the RT&E species, as well as talking a little bit about aesthetics. So all landowners in the United States have a responsibility not to harm or harass rare, threatened, endangered species, particularly on the federal level. And not just harming or harassing the species themselves, it includes altering habitat of known locations. So if you've got a bat, an Indian bat that's in a specific roost tree, you're not allowed to cut that tree down, even though you may not harm the bat. You'll have to not cut their habitat down. So it's important that landowners know that they have a responsibility not to harm or harass these species. One of the big issues that happens is that there's not really good information for private woodland owners whether or not they have RT&Es. It's really tough to say what is on someone's property. Although private woodland owners have a really low chance of having rare, threatened, endangered species on their property. Most of the rare habitats have already either been protected by non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy, or even state and federal locations. So a lot of the State Nature Reserves Commission has their own lands protected, as well as the National Forest land like Daniel Boone. They have the Red River Gorge that has a lot of rare, threatened, endangered species in them that's already protected. So it's not to say that there's no RT&Es on private land. It's just really, really tough to know whether or not there is any on your property. And to get a definitive answer of whether or not there are RT&Es in your property is really expensive. There are private consulting firms that will come out to your property and do investigations to see if anything's out there, but they do cost a lot of money. And at this time, there's really limited resources for woodland owners to have a state worker come and do a thorough inspection on their property. So what we recommend woodland owners to do is to work with the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission. So you can visit naturepreserves.ky.gov. They have the data housed on some of their internal databases. Landowners can send their boundaries to the commission to review against their databases to see what's on their woodlands or what's in their databases and what has been found in their woods in the past, as well as what's found in their neighboring properties. Although this may not rise to the level of having someone come actually physically look at your property. If there's any sort of issues that may arrive, you can use this kind of reaching out to the State Nature Preserves Commission to demonstrate a little bit of due diligence. So you may have not brought out a consultant to look at all the land, but you at least shown that you were interested in it, and you did as much as you could financially and feasibly to see if there were any rare, threatened, endangered species on your property. So this is kind of a brief distribution of what the RTNEs look across the Kentucky. You can kind of see that they're a big portion, again, where the Daniel Boone National Forest is located here in the kind of mid-eastern part of the state, as well as a lot of areas around the major rivers, and then again the land between the lakes out in Kentucky. So this is kind of where their general occurrences are for rare species. But there are some drawbacks, and disappointingly, this information is not free. So anywhere between $50 to $75 is what it costs the State Nature Preserves Commission to review their databases. And unfortunately, the Kentucky Division of Forestry does not have access for this. If you get a stewardship plan through the Kentucky Division of Forestry, there will be a boilerplate statement in there that talks about if you're interested in these RTNEs, and I think anybody that wants to implement a sustainable timber harvest needs to be interested in these. You're going to need to submit your data separately from the stewardship plan to get the data appropriately. So we're going to do an example here to look and see what where you can go on their website to submit a data request. So again, you can pull up any sort of internet search bar and search the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission. It'll bring you this website here. Again, if you need a specific web address, it's naturepreserves.ky.gov, and you're going to come to their website, and there's a lot of information on here about their lands as well as some of the publications. But we're going to look at the data and maps tab here, and you'll see some of these information about the rare plant database. We're going to look at the data request section here. So as the data request section gets pulled up here, we're going to look at a specific copy here, or specific section here. You can either go to the data license online. It'll bring up a form that you can type in online to submit your information to the State Nature Preserves Commission. Usually I'll use this data license form here. It opens up a PDF that we can all look at here. And the PDF just kind of asks for some general information, asks you for your project title, something like RTNE search, your name, address, and phone number, how fast you need the information here. Obviously for one of these, I would say that you're not on a rush job, so you can either get it mailed to you or emailed, and then kind of sign off on it here in the bottom. So this is the form you can submit to the Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission, and they'll provide an estimate of how much it'll cost to do a database search. Again, usually these are around $50 to $75 depending on how big a property you have, and they'll be able to give you an estimate of how much that costs. So again, Kentucky State Nature Preserves Commission website, the data and maps tab, and go to the data request section. You'll be able to request some stuff. There'll also be some information on here about publications of fact sheets, as well as some rare plant database and some general GIS data. But again, they're never going to let you know the locations of all the rare, threatened, endangered species, because that would kind of give up. I mean, they want to protect those areas. They don't want to make all that public. All right, so one thing that may not be in the slide packet for the woodland owners that have been given the printouts from your county extension agent, and I just found this out today, is that there's a new service for woodland owners and even those of private or non-woodlands, such as ag lands, that talks about the special water bodies in Kentucky. So there are both federal and state designations of different types of water bodies, and this is lakes, streams, and rivers. A couple examples here are the scenic wild rivers, reference reaches, outstanding state resource waters, or cold water aquatic habitats. So these are areas that require a lot of special attention. For the most part, these two of the four designations up here actually mandate that there are rare, threatened, endangered species in them. So you can pull up this reference that the Division of Water maintains and look at these special water bodies. And it's a really neat interface that's kind of changed the way that people have gotten the information on here. So I'll, again, pull this website, and this one's got a different website again. Again, you may want to take some notes in your packet to hand out. The website is watermaps.ky.gov/forestry.html. So watermaps, plural, .ky.gov/forestry.html. And you'll see in here that we're already pretty zoomed in here in the south central part of the state, and you've got all these different water bodies that have already shown up that have different designations within Kentucky. So if you live on one of these water bodies, or you're a logger that's about to implement a harvest on one of these areas, I would highly recommend you to visit this website every time and see if you're logging on one of these water bodies. And when you see one of these colored arrows you're working on, the BMPs that we talked about a little bit earlier, they're even more important because of the special nature of them. Most of these are where rare, threatened, endangered species are located. Most of them are either mussels or some sort of fish. So we'll zoom in on a couple of these here in eastern Kentucky, down here in Knox County. And again, this operates a lot like Google Maps or Bing Maps. You can kind of zoom in and out and click on certain things. And so here in eastern Kentucky, I think we're down here in next to Harlan County. So we can click on any of these sort of water bodies and see what makes them special. So I'll click on this one here, and it's going to bring up a dialogue here. And so you can look at this section here that says use design, and it says T&E, that means threatened or endangered, and this OSRW, outstanding state resource water. So this, if there's a harvest that's going to take place on one of these creeks or streams, you're going to need to implement, or I'd recommend that you implement best management practices to protect water quality that go above and beyond what the BMPs say, because if there's any sort of harm that goes after and decreases the species that are within this stream, whatever they are, mussels or fish, you could have major liability issues with the state or federal government. So those loggers and landowners that work in these areas need to be extra careful and extra diligent to protect their water quality. So maybe rather than building a culvert in the stream, maybe you put a bridge up. So just be a little bit more diligent and careful in these areas if they're identified. One good thing about this website is that it's up to date with all of the designations that happen. So they're finding RTNEs almost every year in new places and designating new RTNEs. So when these are new found and they're identified, this map is automatically updated. There used to be really essentially difficult to discern lists that mention river names and mile markers. It was almost impossible to know exactly where these special features were located. Now with this online database, it's really, really easy to find out where they are and to find out if you know that you have one. So you're not going to find out what specific rare species is located within this area, but you'll know that something is there, and you'll know that you'll have to perform a little bit more due diligence and protect that water quality to maintain that rare species and to keep those areas special for the land that you own. All right, so we're going to close out here on kind of the last topic that I'm going to talk about this webinar, and it's going to deal with aesthetic and preservation. So I think it's important to mention this, but in my general opinion, and of course you may totally disagree with me, and I'm completely fine with that, I personally think that this is the least value of concern when it comes to maintaining sustainable timber harvest and sustainable forestry. The key point here is the last bullet here is that I personally think that good forest management cannot be limited by aesthetics. If you've got an area that needs to have a clear cut in it, and it's an area that doesn't have very erodible soils, you're okay with the changes to wildlife, there's no rare plants in the area, I think that you need to do the clear cut and aesthetics be the least of your concern. I also personally think that private property rights are important in this country as well as in this state, and that if you're doing something that isn't immoral, illegal, unethical, or not good forest management, that you should be allowed to do whatever you want to on your own property. Most of the aesthetic issues that deal in hardwoods are quickly overcome. The trees grow pretty fast, they regenerate, they take up the space. Most of these issues with ugly woodlands can eliminate themselves over time. And that's not to say that I think that forestry is pretty, because it certainly isn't. I mean, you've been in some of these areas that are older and mature woodlands that are really neat to walk through, kind of like this picture here, but once you do any type of cut, either light or heavy, it's going to look ugly for a while. I'm the first to fully admit it. Even the best forest management job that's been done, it's always going to look ugly for a couple of years, but trust us that good forest management practices will overcome some of the aesthetic issues. But even though I may feel that way, it's important for those woodland owners that want to have protect some of their aesthetics and the scenic views they have. They need to know what some of their options are, even though I might not think that's important. So you may have some issues with roads that are nearby a harvest that's going on. You may consider putting in a small buffer around them. So in this kind of example from my woodlot, they put in a 60-foot buffer where they retained all the trees around the road and only had an opening around where their landing is, to prevent a lot of mud from getting out, maybe on the road or even mud around the landings. You may want to gravel those areas to keep the trucks clean and to keep the mud from getting onto the road, particularly again around landings and exits. Now there may be some local and state ordinances that require some of these visual buffers to be done. I'm not aware of any in Kentucky at the current time, but that doesn't mean that things are going to change. Out of state, you may have specific requirements for aesthetics. I believe in either Washington or Oregon, or even I know you have in California, certain county roads at certain levels are required to have certain buffers around them. So it's important that you know what your local ordinances are and you follow them and keep it up to date with them. One important thing I will note too is that particularly in hardwood forests, we don't cut out the tops of trees. You just kind of take the main stem or the bole. I'd highly recommend that you leave those cut tops on site. So the bottom left down here, you see that an area where there's been trees harvested and there's a big top in the middle of the forest that I think that needs to be maintained there, primarily for nutrient cycling. So a lot of the nutrients that the tree sucks in and to maintain productivity and to maintain soil productivity, those nutrients eventually need to return to the soil over time through natural decomposition. So you may look at this picture here in the upper right that looks a lot like a park, and there's very little brush that's gone under a tree harvest here. They've taken almost all the big trees out of the way, and you can see there's a little bit of down material in here, but they've taken almost everything. And this actually can be a detriment to sustainable forestry and future productivity. You do want to leave some of these trees out here so that you get a lot of the nutrients returned to the soil. So one of the things we might recommend, rather than taking all the trees out and doing nothing, there may be a little bit of a compromise. So if you've got large tops that are out there, you may want to cut them down into smaller piles and kind of a big debris pile. So rather than having a big stand that may go 4, 5, 6 feet tall for a top, maybe you start cutting out those big pieces and get them maybe only a foot off the ground or 2 feet off the ground, so you can kind of continue that natural nutrient cycling and not harm long-term productivity and long-term sustainability. So I'll close out here again just to kind of review some of the things we talked about here. So we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the appropriate trees to harvest or remain, but just important that you know that obviously is the main thing that we think of. You want to protect your forest or your soils to maintain long-term productivity and to be what's appropriate for those areas in terms of building a landing on or building a road, which ones are more susceptible to rutting. You want to be able to protect your water quality through the use of BMPs, and you need to understand those BMPs, what they're actually meant to be used for and what they're not meant to be used for, so everybody understands what can be done and what can't be done by the Kentucky Division of Forestry. We mentioned these special sites, like I talked about. It's anything that's weird, that's different. Cemeteries, archaeological sites, rock shelters, anything that's out there, you want that flag mapped, and you want to have it clear between you, your forester, and your logger what's going on out there. The same thing for all manner of wildlife, whether rare, threatened, endangered species or more common species such as deer and turkey. You want to know what impacts that sustainable forestry harvest is going to have on it, whether it be good or bad, and whether that meets your objectives based on your species. And then we closed out a little bit of talk on some aesthetic preservation for those that find that important. And again, I personally don't think that that's a big deal. You want to have more important practices done, that the trees that are cut and a good sustainable timber harvest is more important than aesthetics, but I understand those that do desire want to maintain their scenic view. So again, how do I do all this? If I do want to maintain sustainable management, I would advise you to get a lot of help. We already mentioned the Kentucky Division, or the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'd also recommend you obviously reach out to the Kentucky Division of Forestry. You can get a stewardship or management plan from them for free. If you go to forestry.ky.gov, you can visit their website and find out information how to contact their service foresters. And obviously you've got a lot of private consulting foresters or even other natural resource professionals that work for either the U.S. Forest Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or even your local county extension agent. They may be able to help you out, particularly when it comes to soils and some of the areas they may be familiar with. And the key thing is is that what are your objectives? So we've gone over a lot of information here that may be relevant or may not be relevant. It may be acceptable, it may not be acceptable. You need to decide what's important for you. Do you want to keep that aesthetic beauty out there? Do you want to encourage more deer? Do you want rare birds to call your habitat? What are those things that you want to do, and what are the sustainable forestry practices that can be implemented to maintain or develop those resources? So again, if you want to find out more about specific harvesting practices where you get into the nitty-gritty of the specific trees, I'd highly encourage you to attend the webinar on Thursday, December 15th by Billy Thomas. He's going to spend some time talking about these specific woodland practices that I've kind of skirted the edges with. Again, these are held at many of those same sites. Your local county extension agent will be able to tell you if they're hosting this webinar. And if your agent is not going to be hosting it that day, you can either get it archived on ukforestry.org or be able to attend the webinar online from right in your house, like many people are doing for this same webinar. So with that, I'll kind of close it out for questions. Again, my name is Christopher Reeves. You can kind of see my email address on there. I'm free to open any woodland owners questions. We can do a lot of those tonight if we've got the time and you're willing to stick around. But if you come up with something that you think of at home, feel free to email me. Again, it's Christopher Reeves at Christopher.Reeves, excuse me, at uky.org. And with that, we'll go ahead and come back to the studio in here and kind of sit with Billy Thomas, and we'll give you a second to, if anybody's got any questions, you can bring up the chat pod and type it in there, and we'll go ahead and start with the question and answer session. Again, I'd like to thank you all for attending. And
yeah, that's good, Chris. I really appreciate it. You know, there's a lot to think about when you're doing a timber harvest. There really are. You know, I mean, I know a lot of times we concentrate on the trees and how they're doing, but you know, just so many different elements. I'm really appreciated you showing all these other resources that are available. You know, and I think that's the thing a lot of our landowners here in the state don't realize, unfortunately, is there's so much information and resources available to help them really get the most out of their woodlands. And as you mentioned, we will be talking about that a little later on December 15th. But tonight, I'd like to see if we have any questions from the audience. Please use the chat pod to get any questions in. It's a good opportunity to hit Chris up for some questions. Chris, while we're waiting for some of those, I know there's been some changes to the best management practice law here in Kentucky. You know, we've had that law on the books for a while. Could you tell us a little bit about, you know, how those changes came about and why we're doing those changes?
Right. So the changes to the BMPs for water quality are a great example of the land grant mission of the university. So research project was initiated at our research forest, Robinson Forest, about 7 or 8 years ago to test the BMPs. So essentially we had the BMPs 15 years ago, but it was everybody's educated guess about what works best. Right. And so that for our specific area, they haven't really been tested. And this research project was done to figure out what worked really well and maybe where there's some areas where there need to be a little bit of tweaks. And that research project wrapped up about 3 years ago, and over the past year and a half, that research project results have been given to a bunch of key policymakers and a governor-appointed board, and they recommended a couple of changes and tweaks that have finally been approved and will be beginning to be rolled out to landowners starting in January. And there's already been a lot of trainings throughout the summer and the fall for loggers. So it's a great example of the land grant mission of research on the core mission of the university being transitioned to the extension section and then being rolled out to a lot of policy positions to the public. Oh, yeah.
I just love it. Like you said, it's just really good to see how that all comes together. It did look like we had a question pop up. Somebody wanted us to review the website on the soil quality report. I think they maybe talk about the web soil survey there, Chris.
Right, so we'll go back to that. Obviously, there's a substantial amount of information on this website, and I'll recommend, again, the web address is up here, but it's really complicated and not worth telling what it is. So if you go to any internet search bar and type in web soil survey, you'll come to this web page here that's maintained by the Natural Resource and Conservation Service. Click the green button here and it'll bring you up to this section right here, and you can kind of use the section here. Again, it's the key thing about talking about the AOI, the area of intent. And I'll go ahead and kind of reset this thing here. We'll zoom out a little bit. So again, you'll want to navigate to where your property is located or any sort of property and interest using these zoom in and zoom out buttons here. You'll want to define your area of intent. on this little tab here. And again, I'd always recommend using the one on the far right here. That's the polygon. And again, you just kind of draw out your little boundaries here. You don't need to be that exact. That's what I get for drawing one too fancy. Let's go with the square here. There we go. So it'll define where your area of intent is. And then all of the information that's the most valuable is on this little tab here for the soil maps. You click on that, and it brings up the specific soil characteristics. And landowners may be, again, familiar with these specific soil types, but they're not really that helpful to me because I don't know that much information about it. But again, you can click on this other tab here, the Soil Data Explorer, and it brings up all these other kind of things. And obviously, soils are very important, particularly when it comes to land classification, if you're doing any sort of construction or building site development, as well as some waste management ones. For forestry, we're mainly looking for either the vegetative productivity section. There's some information here about productivity, as well as some site index information, as well as, let's see where and the land management one is where the specific rutting hazard information is, as well as some erosion hazard areas that we were talking about earlier. So
it is amazing how much information is available there. And the Christian, I hope that addressed your question. And yes, this is freely available to anybody. Again, you just type in web soil survey into your search bar, and it should pop right up. So anybody can do that from any internet connected device. You probably will need high-speed connection, but other than that, there are no charges for that.
Correct. And it's obviously, I'd definitely use it on your desktop. You're not going to use some sort of tablet or phone. It's way too much information. It's really tough to draw on. We also had a question that talked about, do you see as much logging done now as compared to the past, say, 10 or 15 years ago? Unfortunately, I've only been in the forestry world for about 15 years, and 15 years ago I didn't know what I was doing, so it's really tough to answer that question. Yeah. I would say that in general, the amount of logging usually corresponds to how well housing starts are done. We correspond really well with the general housing market, so things were kind of humming along pretty well and just kind of staying at a steady clip for harvesting level. Then around 2007, 2008, 2009, we had the financial crisis and housing starts went down. The amount of logging went drastically down during that time period. I will say that there has been a major increase in the professionalism and the amount of BMP implementation in Kentucky. So the law has had a really good effect. We were pretty well beforehand, but the law has had the desired effect and has improved in the water quality and BMPs in the state of Kentucky. And it's addressed a lot of issues. Those that are concerned about federal oversight, this actually allows the BMPs to be implemented at state level, and it's handled a lot more locally and kind of deals with a lot of the issues that are brought up in the Federal Clean Water Act, and kind of keeps us away from a lot of federal oversight.
Looks like we had a question as well about the new BMPs. Those are being kind of developed. Some of the support materials are being developed for those right now, all the manuals and that stuff. As those things become available, we will be rolling them out on our website, www.ukforestry.org. They will be prominently featured there, so that'd be the place to stay tuned. We also send out newsletters periodically, and if you're not on any of our email newsletters, you can find out how to get there off of our website as well. So that'd be another way to kind of stay tuned once those things come online.
So, and obviously in the magazine arena, it's kind of again, everything I've talked about today, both the soil survey and the map where you talk about the different types of streams, is free to anybody to use. We talked about earlier, unfortunately, the rare, threatened, endangered databases are not listed online for good reason. They don't want people to know where these species are located, so they can't go harm or harass them. But unfortunately, it's been put behind a little bit of a paywall, so those landowners that want to access that information, even for their own private property, or will have to pay something for it. But you do have to pay for the RT&E stuff. But the soil survey and the special use water designation, they're all available free online.
Yeah, so please take advantage of those resources that are there. And, you know, while we're waiting for some more questions come in via the chat pod, I will mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you want to kind of go back and review some of those things that you were talking about, Chris, it gives folks kind of a chance for you to kind of be their instructor one-on-one with them. So they can put you up in one window and then pull up the another window and go through maybe the web soil survey and some of those other things. The other thing thing I will mention is we do have 3 additional webinars coming up in this series. Hopefully you can join us for those as well. Our very next one's going to be on November 22nd, and we're going to be talking about how to mark your boundary for just your perimeter, your boundary there, how to go about marking that. And we're going to have Laurie Thomas coming in, as well as Scott Schau. So 2 good presenters going to be talking about that. And on November 6th, we're going to be talking about wildlife damage. This will be damage around your homes and gardens, or as tree plantings as well. I'm looking forward to that. And then we will wrap up the series on December 15th with a Caring for Your Woodlands webinar. So please join us there. All other webinars that we do are recorded and posted on our website, and Renee has been so kind to throw up the site there for us. Just give us a check out there at ukforestry.org, and there's a tremendous number of resources available to people, you know, and we have a lot of links that can kind of point them in the right direction as well. So we'll see if we have any more questions coming in, Chris. Okay. Oh, okay.
Again, we'll give it a couple more seconds. Again, if you got any more questions, please type them into the chat box. Again, if you've got any confusion about using the materials, feel free to contact any of us here at the UK Department of Forestry. And again, my email address is christopher.reeds@uky.edu. And again, we're free to help out. We enjoy helping out all the woodland owners in Kentucky, and it's kind of what we do. And if you need any other information that we may be assistance of you, feel free to give us a call or even talk to your local county extension agent.
Okay. So as we'll stick around here for another moment or two, see if any questions pop up. I will like to use this opportunity to thank our county extension agents again for being hosts. They do so much in their communities and really across the state, so a big thank you to them. Also, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you spending the time with us. Chris, I got a lot out of it, and I'm sure they did as well. I will remind our master loggers, if you are at a county extension office, you can get 1 hour credit for this. Just fill out the appropriate form. Your agents will have that. And as well, if you're in an extension office, please complete that evaluation before you leave. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank and acknowledge Renee Williams. She's behind the scenes. She does all the things, Chris, that make this thing come off mostly smooth. So a big thanks to Renee. So folks, again, kind of your last call for questions. We will stick around as long as there are some questions, and we'll be glad to try to answer those. We'll give you just another moment. All right.
Again, thank everybody for attending, and have a good evening.
Yeah, thanks again, folks. We do appreciate you. And there's Chris's email address on the screen, so please take advantage and use that. Feel free to send him an email or reach out to us at ukforestry.org, and we'll be happy to try to help you the best way we can. So thanks, everyone, and have a good evening, and please travel safely.